Alright, welcome to my new Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. review series. This is something that I've been thinking about doing for a while now. The idea germinated back when I was doing live streams about the end of Season 1, and I thought I might start a post-show discussion series type of thing when Season 2 started, and I still intend to do that. The plan right now is to do those as live streams as well, but we'll see. In the meantime, I was looking for something to occupy myself during the summer hiatus, and I started thinking, what about Season 1? Because there's still a lot that's been unsaid about Season 1. And that's what we're going to be doing here. And there were two things that finally made me decide to do this. The first one was a question from my Ask.fm account that I'd like to read for you here. I've heard a lot of critics describe Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. as a hot mess and as Marvel's first failure. Is that true? And my answer: those sound like the comments of critics who saw the first few episodes and then stopped watching. I don't know how you can watch the second half of the first season and say that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. isn't good. Everything from turn on was tremendous. Granted, it had a shaky beginning, but that was largely due to them being forced to hold back until Captain America the Winter Soldier came out. Once the movie tie-in took the handcuffs off, and if you watch interviews where the producers talk about this, it's amazing how many handcuffs there actually were, the show improved by leaps and bounds. Anyone judging Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. by the early stumbling blocks it had to get over is depriving themselves of the great show it's become. And the second thing was a conversation that I had with NJ from the British Fist. And we were Skyping last week, and I had convinced him previously to check the show out. And he'd watched the first 5 episodes, and so he Skypes me one night and he says, "Oh, I don't know, I'm not really digging this. I don't know if I'm going to watch the rest of it. Don't know if I'm going to keep watching." And I said to him, "Look, dude, we talked about this. We went over this, okay? I explained this to you. The first couple episodes are shaky. You have to wait for it to work the kinks out, and then it gets really good. You can't stop watching now. Literally, like, the next episode is when it starts to turn around." So, anyway, the short version is, I don't know if he's going to keep watching, but it made me think back to last year when I was in a similar place with this show, where I didn't feel like it was firing on all cylinders, but I stuck with it, and I ended up being really glad I did. And it occurs to me that some people might not get that. Yeah, they might have given up on it before the show started figuring itself out and turned into something really cool. So I'm going to try to make those people understand that. I'm going to review Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 1, episode by episode. I don't know if I'll be able to get through every episode before Season 2 starts. Probably not, but we'll see. And I'm going to cover everything. The problems the show experienced early on, the source of those problems, how they improved and when, and hopefully I'll be able to convince people why they should be checking out Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. if they're not. So, without further delay, let's get this show a-rolling. So our pilot follows 2 different story threads primarily. The miraculously returned from the dead agent Phil Coulson, putting a team of agents together in response to the Rising Tide hacker group mucking up S.H.I.E.L.D. operations one time too many, and then bringing Skye aboard in the process, and then going on their first mission to contain the newly superpowered Mike Peterson before he goes boom and takes a city block with him. Along the way, we get some teases of future story developments, all of them pretty vague. Of course, the big one being the Coulson mystery of how exactly he came back from the dead. He can never know. Very cryptic show. And also, the tease that a certain organization is backing the Centipede Super Soldier program. And those are going to be our narrative arcs for the time being. That could be a good thing at times, could be problematic at others. First impressions, I like it. Now, it's well cast for the most part, the sets are beautiful, the pacing is tight, the action is fun, the dialogue is snappy, minus the occasional awkward shot or line that would feel a little bit wonky because it was obviously thrown in there just for the trailer. And yes, I will make note of these moments whenever I see them. In S.H.I.E.L.D.'s defense, pretty much every TV show on the air does this. Some do it more gracefully than others. I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying these moments stand out to me, and not always in the way they're probably intended to. But generally, it's a good, solid starting point for a series. However, it is not exactly what I expected. Just FYI, I'm going to be repeating some things I said in earlier live streams here, but for the purposes of this review, I feel like that's necessary just to make sure I cover all the angles. The first thing that surprised me about this show was the tone. Now, for the most part, Marvel seems to want all the movies comprising the cinematic universe, which this show is a part of, to have a similar tone. Now, some are more comedic than others, some are more dramatic than others, but generally they're all in the same basic vicinity. They're all pretty much tonally consistent. And it seems like this show is going to be following suit. And that's the first thing that kind of threw me off about this, because I always felt like Joss Whedon was at his best when he was tackling darker material than this. There's a lot of differences between a Whedon show and then what he did in the Avengers, because as good as the Avengers was, it didn't really get too dark. I mean, there were dark moments where people died and stuff, but it had a lot of light moments and a lot of comedy, and it didn't get too intense. And that seems to be what they're going for here. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's just noticeable. And it's something that I had to kind of get used to because I was expecting something else. And before we go any further with this, we need to understand that even though a lot of us probably went in expecting a Whedon show, that's not what this is. It's not a Whedon show. It's a Marvel show. And boy, do they take great pains in pointing that out. References to everything from the Helicarrier to the Journey into Mystery comic series, callbacks to the Avengers and Captain America, the First Avenger movies, and probably a bunch of other things that I missed along the way. They were really going out of their way to show how firmly ensconced in the Marvel Universe this show is, which turned out to be both a positive and a negative. Now, on the plus side, this was like geek crack to me, and I'm sure to a lot of other Marvel fans. But the weird thing is, if you take those references out, you almost wouldn't know this was a Marvel show. Because those references to the Marvel Universe at large, and in general, were really all the tie-ins that we got. Because they weren't really allowed to do anything else. And this is where the handcuffs come in. And in order to really understand this situation, you have to understand what the producers were dealing with, what they were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do, and the restrictions that the studio, and I guess Disney too, put on them in the process of making this show. I've seen so many interviews where they talk about this, talk about how they weren't allowed to do certain things, weren't allowed to say certain things, or use certain characters that they wanted to use. They actually, this is a true story, they actually were not allowed to say the word Hydra. Yeah. That was one of the mandates the studio put on them. They could not say the word Hydra. Now think about that for a minute. Put yourself in the producer's shoes, all right? You've got this massive, massive plot twist that's happening halfway through the season that's going to completely turn the entire show on its head with this movie tie-in, and you're not allowed to even say the name of the organization responsible for it. I mean, good God. I mean, I can't even imagine how frustrating that situation must have been. They have Coulson say the line, "We didn't cut the head off the centipede," obviously a reference to the Hydra line, cut off one head, two more will take its place. They're doing everything they possibly can to reference Hydra without actually saying Hydra. And it's kind of ridiculous when you think about how limited the show must have been in the beginning, how frustrating that must have been for the producers and the writers to have to work around just crazy restrictions like this, and how freeing that must have been once the movie tie-in started and all those handcuffs came off. And they finally had the freedom to make the show the way they wanted to make it and the way it always should have been made in the first place. I mean, I've seen other interviews where they talk about how they're so excited that they can finally do what they want, and now they suddenly have all this extra freedom that they didn't have before, and they can do all these things that they couldn't do before. And that's why, if you look at the show in the beginning, and you look at where it ended up at the end of the season, it's like a completely different show now. All thanks to those handcuffs being taken off, and now that the movie tie-in is out of the way and they don't have to worry about that anymore, it's a much more exciting program going forward. Now, first impressions about our cast of characters. Coulson is back as our lead, and he's back at his Coulson-y best. I confess I never really understood the whole Coulson Lives movement. I didn't really get what it was about this character that that captured so many people's attention. He was a likable character, but when so many people were just dying to see him return to life, I was like, really? I don't. What's so special about this guy? I didn't understand that at the time, but I was happy to see him back because now I get to find out what's so special and what people see in him. So he's kind of our gateway. He's the tie-in from the movies to the show. And then we have all the newbies, starting with Grant Ward. The criticism of this guy in the beginning was that most people seem to think he was kind of a tool. And he is. You know, he comes off as a bit of a stereotypical hard-ass, stick-in-the-mud type of guy who's great in a scrap, but he has terrible people skills. You know, the kind of thing that's been done a lot in other shows, and I can see why people didn't really gravitate toward this guy, because this kind of character really felt out of place in a show with Joss Whedon's stamp on it. Because normally he likes characters to be more unique than this, and I think it's hilarious and also really awesome that the character was acting this way on purpose. He wasn't intended to be this way. He was acting this way on purpose just to pull a wool over Coulson's eyes, sucker him in, and get onto the plane. Because he knew that Coulson likes a project, so it was all to act like someone who Coulson thought he could help. Damn you, Hydra. It was actually a really bold and risky move by the writers, because there was no guarantee that this show was, going to have the viewership and was going to get a full season, and they were going to be able to do the big Ward heel turn when the movie tie-in started. And there was a good chance that a lot of people would just write this guy off as just a kind of a lame character, and they wouldn't even get to the part where they reveal that, holy shit, he's not that lame. He's actually really interesting, because that whole thing in the beginning where he was acting like a tool was all an act. It was a really gutsy move, and I'll credit for him, because it was, it was tough going in the beginning when a lot of people didn't like this guy, but man, did it pay off later on. And to be honest, I never really had a problem with Ward. I didn't think he was the most interesting member of the cast, but I thought he was all right. The one I had a problem with originally was Skye. Now, my issues with Skye in the beginning were that it seemed like the writers were trying really, really hard, maybe a little too hard, to fit her into the central ass-kicking heroine role that Whedon puts into all of his shows. And I just felt like that was kind of an awkward fit on Chloe Bennet. I don't know if it was the character needing to be tweaked or Chloe not feeling totally comfortable with the character yet. For whatever reason, it just felt like it was a bit much. I think about the diner scene with her and Mike Peterson, where she's trying to act like an excited fangirl meeting some guy with superpowers, and it just seems like she's trying a little too hard to act that way. The interrogation scene where she's trying to act all cool and hip, and she's just trying a little too hard. I was just very aware that she was acting during these scenes. It felt like they were trying to kind of force a round peg into a square hole. This is something that improved a lot later on. Once the writers kind of figured out how to write for her, and eventually they fleshed out Skye a lot more, and we learned why she's there and the reasons for her to be there beyond just being a super awesome hacker person. Once that happened, my issues with this character became a lot smaller, and eventually they disappeared. And I like Skye a lot more now, but in the beginning, it was kind of awkward. Next, we have Melinda May, and this was probably the character that made the least impression on me early on. And it had nothing to do with Ming-Na Wen's performance. She's a fine actor, but the character just had very little to do in this episode. You know, we know her and Coulson have a history from way back when, and she used to be a field agent, but now she's in administration, and she does not want to go back into the field because of reasons. But when she has to, she can really kick ass in a fight, and that's it. That's all we get from May. She doesn't even have that much dialogue, really. She was definitely the biggest victim of the focus of this episode being on other stuff, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's just really unfortunate that we don't get much from May here. So at best, I had to label her a to be continued because there wasn't a lot to go on at first. But then we get to the real stars of this show, in my opinion. My favorite characters, Fitz and Simmons. My God, this casting could not have been more perfect. Not only are these the two that most fully embody their characters, not only is the chemistry between them amazing, not only are they the two best actors of the show, in my opinion, not only are they dripping with personality, not only are they just freaking adorable together, but from the very beginning, these two were, by a wide margin, the most Whedon-esque characters of the entire cast. And you can tell immediately by the way they're constantly weirding out the other characters with their zany behavior. So if you're looking for a gateway into the Whedonverse, looking for something to latch on to in that regard, Fitz and Simmons, they're your ticket. Now, something I've been noticing more and more as I start to rewatch this series is foreshadowing. And I'll be mentioning this periodically as I do these videos because I think it's really impressive how deceptively good this show is at planting seeds for future events and future story developments that people didn't see coming, that I sure as hell didn't see coming at the time. And the big one in this episode is in the first scene with Ward. He says the line, "If the job was easy, wouldn't be any fun." Bit of a cheesy line, and you wouldn't think more of it at the time, but later on in the season when Garrett shows up and he drops that same line, you realize, whoa, that's where Ward got that. That's where that line came from. They had that planned the whole time just so they could drop that little reference to foreshadow the connection between Ward and Garrett. Very clever show. Very clever. And stuff like this might not seem like a big deal to most of you, and I guess it's really not. But attention to small details like that really sell me on a show because that shows you how much the writers care. And knowing that this is the kind of thing the writers like to hint at has made me change the way I look at this show and re-examine everything that they're doing. And suddenly, I'm looking for hints about future stories everywhere, looking for double meanings, and there's tons of stuff like this everywhere, in almost every episode, I think. It's a lot of fun finding all these Easter eggs. I'm really having a ball with this. But I can't just talk about the good stuff. The show did have its share of hurdles to overcome in the beginning. I think most people recognize that now. So let's talk about some of the problems with this episode in order to have a more complete review. I have two nitpicks with this episode, and also some larger issues that I'll talk about afterward. But this is going to sound silly. I had a bit of a problem with the way this episode opened. You know, it starts with Skye narrating over footage of the Marvel movies. You're talking about how the world has changed, and now we know that, you know, heroes exist, and all this super crazy crap exists in the world, and you can't shield us from the truth, and blah, blah, blah. And this always seemed awkward to me for some reason. It's really hard to put my finger on why exactly, but it seemed like it was they were being overly dramatic or overly hokey or overly something. It felt like the setup to something that didn't happen. And I know it's not fair to compare this to other Whedon projects, but I have to for this. I think back to the beginning of the Buffy pilot. It starts with these two people sneaking into the high school, a guy and a girl, and of course the guy has sexual predator written all over him, and the girl seems very innocent and unassuming, and you're thinking that something bad is about to happen to this girl. And then they invert your expectations, and Darla whirls around, and holy shit, she's a vampire, and then she, sinks her fangs into this guy. So you think they're going one way, and then they go another way, and I thought that's what they were doing here. And then they didn't. This opening narration just felt like the setup to a punchline or a swerve that then didn't happen. And I think the writers recognized that there was something off about this too, because they actually made fun of this in a later episode. In the tie-in to Thor: The Dark World, that episode starts the same way, and then we get the punchline with Simmons talking about how it's just a huge mess to clean up, and then you get the setup and the punchline afterward, and then it works. Then it's effective. Here, it felt like they were doing something and then they didn't go all the way with it, or they didn't have it thought out properly, and I don't know. Something about this always felt off to me. But that's not really a big deal in the grand scheme of things. That's just something that kind of bugged me about the beginning of this episode. Something I think really hurt this. Something I always felt hurt this episode. Even back when I saw it the first time, it was lacking some kind of dramatic hook at the end. Some kind of cliffhanger to tease you about future stories and get you really excited to come back next week. And again, I got to reference another Whedon project. The ending of Dollhouse, the Dollhouse pilot. Now, I was not exactly wild about the Dollhouse pilot until the very end, when they cut away to a different location and you see Alpha from behind, and he's naked and he's doing some kind of weird, freaky crap. And I was like, oh my god, that's creepy as hell. What's going on with that guy? What's this all about? I have to tune in next week to see what's going on here. This episode needed something like that. It needed a good cliffhanger at the end, and maybe you put it in like the stinger at the end. This episode didn't have a stinger for some reason. All the other episodes had stingers. This one did not. I thought that was strange. Instead of a cliffhanger, it ends on some kind of on like a light, uplifting note with us finding out that Lola is a flying car, and Coulson and Skye zooming off on another crazy adventure. And that's not a bad way to end the show, but it's not a cliffhanger. I've thought about this a lot, and what I keep coming back to over and over again is that this episode needed Nick Fury. Now, they had the Maria Hill cameo, which I appreciated, but it really needed an appearance by Nick Fury. Because considering what he did in the finale and what we learned about him and his involvement in the Coulson resurrection story, I felt it was very important that we have him in the pilot to kind of bookend that. And the crazy thing is, they actually had Samuel L. Jackson appearing as Nick Fury in the end credits stinger of the second episode, in an appearance that was really just there for shits and giggles, for comedic purposes, and it didn't really mean anything. To this day, I felt wrong about that. What I would have done is, since they proved that they can get Samuel L. Jackson to appear in just little bit roles like this, I would have taken him out of that episode, put him in the pilot, and done an end credit stinger, and done something, I don't know what, but something to foreshadow his involvement in the Coulson Return from the Dead subplot. Because this was one of the big problems that a lot of people that I saw noticed that a lot of people were having with the show in the early goings, that they weren't really digging this Coulson, like the mystery of how he came back to life. They weren't sure why this was being dragged out so long, and they were kind of frustrated by this. And they were like, oh yeah, we get it, he's a robot, can we move on please? Why is this... Why are we still not progressing this at all? I think if the show had hinted that Fury had some kind of involvement, whatever it was, in that Coulson resurrection, I think that would have helped enormously. If people had just known that Fury was involved somehow, it would have made it seem more important somehow, I guess. People would have known that if Fury is involved, if they're bringing in Sam Jackson to be a part of that, then this must be worth paying attention to. It must be worth drawing out. It's going to be worth the payoff at the end when we get to it. We didn't have anything like that. It seems like such a small detail, but I really think if they just brought in Sam Jackson for like a 60-second cameo in the pilot, it would have made a lot of difference in that particular storyline. And that leads me to the main issues with this pilot in my mind. And this is something that I was thinking an awful lot about the first time I saw it last year. I watched it again. It's still an issue. The focus of the story, and I'm not saying the story is bad, because generally I think the whole thing gels pretty well, but the focus of this is skewed pretty heavily between Skye and Mike Peterson, and as a result, we don't really spend a lot of time with the team. You know, it kind of felt like the Skye and Mike show at times, and as a result, there isn't a lot of screen time left over for the team. And you know, even the first time I'm watching this, I was thinking to myself, you know, I like this Mike Peterson character, I like J. August Richards, but why are we spending so much time on this when we haven't even really established the main characters in the team yet? You know, it just seemed very odd to me. As it turns out, the Mike Peterson character is explored and developed more and receives more attention than a lot of the main characters. You know, May and Fitzsimmons in particular. And that just always seemed odd. It's like, well, I mean, I don't understand why this guest star is apparently more important than, you know, getting to know the mains. And it's not just some of the main characters who get the short end of the stick because of this, too. I thought it was very strange how the focus of the story seems to skew from one thing to another about halfway through the episode. You know, as we start out, the reason for the team coming together, the whole impetus for the team being put together in the first place, or so Coulson thinks, you know, or so Coulson is led to believe, and or so we think at the time, is in response to this rising tide threat. But then, about 20 minutes in, they capture Skye, and they bring her aboard, and then suddenly we're off on this mostly unrelated Mike Peterson mission, and this rising tide thing is not really addressed again. I didn't feel like there was enough connective tissue between these two separate stories, and it feels like, well, we're focusing on one thing, and then that kind of gets put on the back burner when we start ignoring that so we can focus on this other thing. It kind of felt like they were trying to do 2 episodes in one here, or more accurately, it felt like the first half of one episode and the second half of a different episode. I think it would have benefited this pilot enormously to just do a 2-hour pilot, or split the stories of this episode into 2 episodes. As a pilot, focus on Skye's introduction into the team, and so you can devote more attention to this rising tide angle. You can, you know, further flesh that out. You can devote more attention to your main characters and developing them a little bit. Put more, you know, attention and more development on May and Fitzsimmons. Give them a little more to do and help us learn more about them. By the end of the episode, now you've got the whole team formed. And then in the episode after that, then do the Mike Peterson thing. I thought that would have worked a lot better, because as it is, it almost feels like they're trying to do a little bit too much and focus on the rising tide storyline and focus on certain members of the cast. Kind of got lost in the process because we're devoting so much attention to Mike Peterson, and now, you know, later on we understand why he was so important, but at the time, I just didn't get it. So, final thoughts on Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. based on episode 101, Pilot. I like it. It's not without a few problems, a few hiccups along the way. I don't think it's the strongest episode of the season, but I liked it a lot more in hindsight Now knowing what it was setting up story-wise, and knowing about the restrictions and the handcuffs that the producers had to work around and circumvent in order to do that stuff. I wasn't in love with it yet at this point, but I saw the potential in it, and I liked it enough to want to come back and watch the next episode and see where it goes from there. And because of that, I still think this does a better job than most pilots these days do. It might not be the strongest Whedon pilot ever, but I do still think it's a strong pilot. However, just as important as the pilot is the follow-up. Now, this was about hooking the viewers. The next episode is about keeping them. And unfortunately, the next episode is where a lot of the problems Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. experienced in the early goings began to rear their ugly heads. Find out why next time as I dive into episode 102 of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 1, 084. I'll see you then.